Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, June 21st, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. A U.S. accounting error gives $6.2 billion to Ukraine. So the Pentagon on Tuesday claimed that an accounting error has freed up an additional $6.2 billion to spend on military aid for Ukraine. So Pentagon Deputy Press Secretary Sabrina Singh told reporters that weapons sent to Ukraine from U.S. military stockpiles using the Presidential Drawdown Authority were overvalued by using the cost to replace the arms rather than the depreciated value. Singh said, quote, in a significant number of cases, services used replacement costs rather than net book value, thereby overestimating the value of the equipment drawdown from U.S. stocks and provided to Ukraine, end quote. So if you remember, reports first started to surface last month that said that the Pentagon may have overvalued weapons that it was sending to Ukraine. At the time, the estimate was that the error would account for at least $3 billion in new funds for Ukraine, but that has more than doubled now. Singh said that for the 2023 fiscal year, the Pentagon overvalued weapons by $3.6 billion. In the 2022 fiscal year, it was by $2.6 billion. So the additional funds mean that the White House might not need to ask Congress to authorize more spending on Ukraine before the end of the 2023 fiscal year, which is September 30th for the federal government. So it's a very convenient error that gives the U.S. a lot more money to work with to dump more weapons into Ukraine, during this counteroffensive. Again, this is the Presidential Drawdown Authority. So these are funds that could be used to ship stuff straight from U.S. military stockpiles. And now, while this does give the White House more room to work with, I do think if they did ask Congress for more spending on Ukraine, that they would get it. I mean, there's still very strong bipartisan support for funding the proxy war. Maybe, that might change some more in a few months if this, counteroffensive is a failure, and, it might make more people start thinking about, what are we going to do? Just keep pouring weapons into this open-ended conflict that when they have no idea when it might end. I don't know. Hopefully more opposition grows, but I think, this summer, if the Biden administration did ask for more spending, they would get it. But this, again, this makes their life easier so they don't have to worry about it now for a while. $6.2 billion, again, in weapons that they could just ship straight to Ukraine. So, I think this goes to show that they could, play with these numbers however much as they want to. The Pentagon always fails audits. There's trillions in spending that's unaccounted for over the past few decades. I mean, they could really just do whatever they want. Okay, so the next one here, Lockheed Martin is standing by to help Ukraine with F-16s. So the U.S. weapons maker Lockheed Martin says that it is standing by to help Ukrainians fly and maintain F-16 fighter jets once NATO countries finalize their plans to provide Kiev with the aircraft. So Lockheed Martin is also ready to manufacture more F-16s to backfill the stockpiles of countries that ship their jets to Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has been a boon for Lockheed Martin as they make many of the weapon systems being poured into the conflict zone, including the Javelin anti-tank missiles, which is a big one. They've sent thousands and thousands of them, I think 10,000 of those into Ukraine. And they also make the HIMARS rocket systems, which is also another big one. So this is Frank St. John. He's the chief operating officer of Lockheed. He told Financial Times, quote, "We are standing by, ready to not only backfill needs as it arises with the new F-16 builds, but also any modifications to F-16s, as well as training, equipment, and systems," end quote. So there's still a long way to go before Ukraine is armed with F-16s, as pilots still need training, and we're not sure yet which countries are going to give Ukraine F-16s. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark are all expected to, but they haven't made commitments yet. It's still being worked out. So St. John said that initial training and support will take place in a third country, but he said Lockheed Martin is eyeing setting up shop in Ukraine in the future. He said, quote, when the hostilities end, there will have to be a sustaining presence for training and maintenance, and then the logical place would be for that to be in and around Ukraine, end quote. So Russia has strongly warned against the provision of these F-16s for Ukraine, as it will mark a significant escalation of NATO support, NATO involvement. If Ukraine gets these things, they're going to need to be maintained. It would probably, I would guess, contractors probably working for the Pentagon would be maintaining this fleet, and that is another level of just U.S. and NATO involvement in the war. All right, the next one here. Ukraine is still pushing for a NATO membership commitment at the Vilnius summit. So Ukrainian officials are still calling for NATO to give them some kind of guarantee or some kind of commitment on their future NATO membership. They want them to say that they can join NATO after the end of the war. And this comes a day after Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, said on Monday that there will be no formal invitation for Ukraine to join the alliance at the summit. So this is Ukraine's ambassador to NATO. She told Politico that Kiev seeks some kind of invitation or at least a commitment to look at the time frame of their membership. She said that they're being realistic. They're not pushing to get membership right now, but they want some kind of commitment for when the war is over. But right now, there's no end to this conflict in sight, and such a commitment to Ukraine, as we know, as we're always covering, Russia's main thing, their main demand in the negotiations, and one of their biggest motives for invading Ukraine was Ukraine's alignment with NATO, was Ukrainian neutrality is what they want. So if NATO says, okay, once this war is over, then you can become a NATO member, as long as Russia can keep fighting this funding and fighting this war, that's as long as it's going to go. This is their thing. This is the main thing. This is what this is all about. So any kind of promise like that, it just guarantees war for, a long time. All right. So the next one here, President Biden says that the threat of Putin using nukes is real. So President Biden said this on Monday, that the threat of Russian President Vladimir Putin using tactical nuclear weapons is real. And he made these comments to donors during a trip to California. He said, quote, when I was out here about 2 years ago saying that I was worried about the Colorado River drying up, everybody looked at me like I was crazy. They looked at me like when I said I worry about Putin using tactical nuclear weapons. It's real, end quote. So kind of a strange, way of saying it, but that's what he's saying. And President Biden has previously recognized that the policy of the U.S. and NATO backing Ukraine against Russia risks nuclear war. In October 2022, he said that the chances of nuclear Armageddon were higher than at any point since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. So, despite recognizing that, he hasn't done anything to ease tensions since warning, of nuclear Armageddon. I remember at the time I thought, oh, maybe this is a good sign because it shows he actually realizes the risks here. Maybe he's going to cool things down, but no. He's done nothing to ease tensions and continues to escalate U.S. involvement in the war, most recently by giving the okay for the F-16s. And Biden administration officials have also repeatedly expressed support for Ukrainian attacks on Crimea using U.S.-made weapons. And they're shrugging off these Ukrainian attacks inside Russia. There was a recent New York Times report that said earlier in the war, the Biden administration was worried that Ukrainian attacks in Russia could escalate the war. They were worried about Putin using a tactical nuke. Now they're not as worried. Apparently Biden, thinks it's a real threat though, but he's not going to do anything to change that. So, it's just really just an insane policy. If you actually think that the chances of nuclear war are this high, then why don't you do something to stop it? All right, the next one here. Russia says that Ukraine is planning strikes in Crimea with Western arms. So Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said on Tuesday that the Russian military has information that shows Ukraine is plotting to attack Crimea with U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems. and British provided Storm Shadow cruise missiles. So Shoigu said, quote, according to our data, the leadership of the Ukrainian armed forces is planning to deliver strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation, including Crimea, with HIMARS and Storm Shadow missiles, end quote. So Shoigu warned that such strikes would make the U.S. and Britain direct parties to the conflict and warned of a potential response. He said, quote, the use of these missiles outside the zone of our special military operation would mean that the United States and Britain would be fully dragged into the conflict and would entail immediate strikes on decision-making centers in Ukraine, end quote. So while the Biden administration has said that it does not want Ukraine using U.S.-provided weapons on Russian territory, the restriction does not apply to Crimea, which Russia has controlled since 2014, and the people that live there want to be part of Russia. You know, they're not asking to be liberated by the Ukrainians. They want to stay in Russia. But Ukraine and its Western backers do not recognize the peninsula as Russian territory. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan reiterated the U.S. position last month. He said that the U.S. has not placed limitations on Ukraine being able to strike on its territory, and they consider Crimea to be Ukrainian territory. Sullivan's comments drew protests from Moscow as Crimea is a major red line for Putin, which Secretary of State Antony Blinken has actually acknowledged. But as the war drags on, as I've said a few times already, the Biden administration is less and less concerned about escalating the conflict. So, you know, we see these warnings a lot from Russia, and it seems like the U.S. is just not concerned about, you know, anything that Russia's military brass is saying, you know, warning that there will be escalations if there's attacks on Crimea. All right, the next one here. Report claims that China wants a training facility in Cuba. So the Wall Street Journal reported on Tuesday that Beijing and Havana are negotiating to establish a joint military training facility in Cuba, something the report acknowledged China would be exploring as a response to further U.S. military entrenchment in Taiwan. So the Wall Street Journal actually provided context on this, but it's not really clear if this report is true. It cited unnamed U.S. officials, and the official said that the intelligence is based on a reference contained in a U.S. intelligence assessment, which they described as convincing but fragmentary. So it doesn't sound like it's very solid intelligence. The official said that the U.S. intelligence report suggests that the talks between China and Cuba are at an advanced stage, but have not been concluded. They said that the Biden administration has contacted Cuba in an attempt to stop the potential deal. So this new claim comes after U.S. accusations that China has had spying capabilities in Cuba since at least 2019, which China has denied. And those allegations started with another Wall Street Journal report that was published on June 8th. And that claimed that China and Cuba were discussing setting up a spy facility in Cuba. The White House denied it, but then a Biden administration official later said, oh, yeah, they've had spying capabilities in Cuba for a while. Again, China denied it. These reports seem to are suspiciously timed. You know, that first one came out right before Blinken went to China, and this next one came out right when he got back. So if the claims about the training facility are true, Beijing's efforts would clearly be a response to the U.S. building up militarily in areas near China. And this is something that the Wall Street Journal report recognized. The report said, quote, U.S. intelligence officials say that Beijing sees its actions in Cuba as a geographical response to the U.S. relationship with Taiwan. The U.S. invests heavily in arming and training the self-governing island that sits off mainland China and that Beijing sees as its own, end quote. So Taiwan is roughly 100 miles from the coast of mainland China, which is about the same distance Cuba is from Florida. The major difference between the two islands is that China considers Taiwan to be its own territory, and the U.S. does not claim Cuba. And also, you know, the whole entire U.S.-China relationship is based on the U.S. not having a military presence in Taiwan. The U.S. withdrew all of its troops from Taiwan in 1979 as part of its normalization deal with China. Now, the U.S. has always sold weapons to Taiwan since then. So there's been, military trainers, but a small handful, like a few dozen at a time at most. But in recent years, the U.S. has been boosting its diplomatic and military ties with Taiwan. And this year, the U.S. deployed about 200 troops to Taiwan to help with training, which is the largest known U.S. military presence on the island since 1979. And the Wall Street Journal report also acknowledged that the U.S. has dozens of military bases near China, while Beijing does not have a comparable military presence in the Western Hemisphere. And, the U.S. just expanded its military presence in the Philippines, which is pretty close to China. So this report, I wanted to read the quote just because it's interesting, to see the Wall Street Journal actually including this. It said, quote, China has no combat forces in Latin America, according to U.S. officials. Meanwhile, the U.S. has dozens of military bases throughout the Pacific where it stations more than 350,000 troops, end quote. So, the Pacific is a pretty broad region, but still the U.S. has a major military presence near China, and China has nothing comparable to that near the U.S. So, of course, all the China hawks are in a frenzy over this again, which is to be expected. All right, the next one here, this is from the South China Morning Post, why China still refuses to resume military dialogue with the U.S. This article is interesting. So they quote mainland Chinese defense analysts who I think usually have a pretty good idea of the Chinese government's thinking. And so China snubbed requests by the United States to resume military dialogue between the two countries because it is not satisfied that Washington will stop violating its core interests on such issues as Taiwan, mainland military analysts have said. So Blinken told reporters at the end of his visit to Beijing that Chinese leaders have not agreed to the repeated requests by the American side for a dialogue to reduce the risk of military misunderstanding or miscalculations. So what I think is, this is really an interesting quote here. So Blinken's remarks indicated that Washington wanted to secure the absolute prevention and avoidance of military conflict, but still continue to challenge China's core interests, said Shi Yinhong, who is an international relations professor at Beijing's Renmin University. So she said, quote, China has resisted giving such absolute assurances because it fears that it would amount to letting the U.S. keep boosting its support for Taiwan. The PLA also seeks the prevention of conflict as a top task, but it relies more on the experience of frontline troops on both sides, end quote. So she said that if the present state of U.S. discourse continued, China would probably never agree to resume military-to-military communications. And these are channels that China suspended after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. So her reckless, trip for a photo op, it sparked the largest ever Chinese military drills around Taiwan. And the effects of it are still being felt now as China's kept up the military pressure on Taiwan and, has kept these dialogues suspended. So I think it's interesting. And, that's kind of what I've been thinking is that all the U.S. is saying is, oh, we want to talk. We want to talk. We got to talk. Talking's good, right? Which I agree. Talking is good. It's good that there is dialogue at least happening at some levels, but they're not talking about really changing things or resolving issues between the two sides. So I think until they actually make a sincere effort to do that, this is going to still be an issue. And so you have China doing this, not resuming the military dialogue, and also starting to react to the U.S. warplanes constantly flying over the South China Sea and the U.S. warships going through the Taiwan Strait. So this is brewing, and the Biden administration really has to do something here if they want to ease tensions instead of just kind of talking for the sake of talking. All right, the next one here, the Pentagon's $52,000 trash can. So this is from Responsible Statecraft from Connor Eccles. Leading military contractors jacked up the price of several everyday products after receiving non-competitive contracts, costing taxpayers more than $1.3 million in apparent unnecessary markups, according to Pentagon contracting data acquired by Responsible Statecraft. So until 2010, Boeing charged an average of $300 for a trash container used in the E-3 Sentry, a surveillance and radar plane based on the 707 civilian airliner. That 300, even that seems like a lot. $300. When the 707 fell out of use in the United States, the trash can was no longer a commercial item, meaning that Boeing was not obligated to keep its price at previous levels, according to a weapons industry source who spoke to Responsible Statecraft. In 2020, the Pentagon paid Boeing over $200,000 for 4 of the trash cans, translating to roughly $51,606 per unit. In a 2021 contract, the company charged $36,000 each for 11 trash containers, resulting in a total cost of more than $400,000. The apparent overcharge cost taxpayers an extra $600,000 between the two contracts. So, I mean, this is just, there's so much of this going on in these deals. And, they mentioned non competitive contracts, and that's something they're trying to do more of, including in these Pentagon spending bills to make it as quick as possible, to make deals as quick as possible. So non competitive. And they want to also get rid of red tape that tries to at least keep prices lower. So I think we're going to just even see more of this, more prices jacked up like this. But it's just insane. And this is part of the reason why our military budget is so high, is because this stuff, just the cost keeps rising because they can get away with it. All right, the last one here. The Saudis signal openness to a naval alliance with Iran. So Saudi Foreign Minister Prince Faisal bin Farhan met with his Iranian counterpart in Tehran on Saturday and signaled that Riyadh is open to a naval alliance with Tehran, an idea that was recently put forward by Iran's Navy chief. So Prince Faisal said at a joint press conference with Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian, Faisal said, quote, "I would like to point out the importance of cooperation between our two countries concerning the regional security, especially the security of maritime navigation and waterways," end quote. So Iran's Navy commander said earlier this month that Iran was working to form a naval alliance with regional countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Iraq. So the potential maritime coalition goes against U.S. and Israeli plans for the region. They want to form an anti-Iran alliance between Israel and the Gulf Arab states. But this Iran-Saudi normalization really got in the way of things here. Iran's foreign minister said that that he discussed with Faisal increasing cooperation in all areas, including security, and he stressed Iran's view that regional security will be ensured by regional actors only without external interference, and that is a clear reference to the U.S. And this increased cooperation, of course, comes after this surprise China-brokered normalization deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Faisal said, quote, "Our relations are based on a clear foundation of full and mutual respect for independence, sovereignty, and non-interference in internal affairs," end quote. So this is something I think, if they really do start cooperating militarily, the U.S. might really try hard to do something to sabotage that type of cooperation. But that is it for the news for today. Go check out our Viewpoints, one from Chris Hedges, the imminent extradition of Julian Assange and the death of journalism. That's over at Consortium News. We have one from Andrew Basevich, Where Did We Go Wrong in Afghanistan? I could think of a few things. Sorry, this just isn't loading. Oh, that's at the New York Times. Good to see Basevich getting published there. One from Batul Suleiman, Why the U.S. Sought Secret Talks with Iran. That's over at the Cradle. We have one from Mike Mahari, the American Empire and Your Liberty. That's over at the 10th Amendment Center. Go check that out. And our spotlight is from Trevor Tim. Daniel Ellsberg was one of history's most consequential figures. That's over at The Guardian. But that's everything for me for today. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate and also share the show. Share it, tell your friends about antiwar.com. Comment, if you watch the video, leave comments. Engagement is good. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.